On her wedding night, Marin Doyle cried alone in the most expensive bed she had ever slept in. 51 floors up, the whole city of Chicago spread out behind black glass like a bed of embers slowly going cold, and the only sounds in that room were the steady breath of the heater and the snow brushing against the window. She lay on her side, her face buried in the pillow, both hands clenched around the hem of a borrowed white dress. The faded green apron from the diner was still tied at her waist, because she had worked the afternoon shift right up until the papers were signed, and there had been no time to take it off. She did not know he was standing in the doorway. Rafael Santoro had stopped there, snow still clinging to the shoulders of his black wool coat, one hand raised to undo a cufflink and then held there, halfway. He looked at her for a long time, long enough to hear a sob swallowed down, long enough to watch a tear run along the bridge of her nose and fall to the pillow, long enough that a man who had given orders to an entire waterfront stood as still as someone who had wandered into a stranger's home by mistake. Then he fastened the cuff again. He stepped back from the doorway without a sound and without a word, and the elevator doors closed behind him, cutting off the last strip of light that reached into the room. Marin listened to the elevator going down. She lay there, waiting for it to stop and come back up. It never came back up. She cried until morning. All of Chicago called Rafael Santoro, the man who had buried his own mother and younger brother, under the concrete at Cortlandt Row. They said there was nothing left of his heart, and that night, Marin believed them. Yet before another year had passed, that same man would walk into a live broadcast hearing and put his entire empire on the scale, for no other reason than to keep her. And the real reason he turned away that night was a secret 6 winters old, one that only Marin in all the world could unlock except she had forgotten it. Stay with us to the end, because the moment she remembers what she once did for this man in a snow-filled alley, she will understand that for all those months, she had been afraid of the one person who had spent 6 winters waiting for the chance to return a single cup of coffee. If this story reaches you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, share it with whoever came to mind just now, and subscribe so you can walk through every story still ahead with us. The season's first snow came to Cortlandt Row on a Thursday afternoon, falling slowly and thickly, as though someone were sifting flour over the entire row of red brick buildings, whitening the steaming manhole covers and the cars parked along the curb. Doyle's diner stood on the corner, its windows fogged with condensation, the red neon sign hanging above it missing one stroke since the previous summer, so the word diner now looked like something that wasn't English at all. Marin Doyle had stopped trying to fix it because the electrician wanted $400. Inside were 11 red leather stools lined up along the counter, 6 booths set against the wall, a coffee maker that gurgled every time it started, and the smell of bacon that had soaked into every grain of wood for 30 years and could never be scrubbed away. It was where her mother had waited tables until the final winter of her life. Now, it was Marin's turn. She stepped outside with a dish towel draped over her shoulder, pretending to wipe down a window that was already clean, then peeled away the notice posted in the lower right corner. The paper had gone cold and stiff beneath the snow. She folded it into quarters, slipped it into the pocket of her apron, and did all of it in less time than it took to draw a single breath, because through the glass she could see Micah bent over the paper napkin spread across the table, a blue crayon in his hand, drawing the 4-engine airplane he had been drawing over and over again for the entire month. When she came back inside, he looked up. "What was that outside, Aunt Marin?" "Just snow," Marin said. "I was wiping the window." The boy nodded and lowered his head to continue drawing, adding a small window near the tail of the airplane. She stood there watching that curly head for another second before going behind the counter. The last customer left just as the streetlights came on. Marin turned the sign to closed, locked the upper latch, then took the old cookie tin from the drawer beneath the cash register. She emptied everything onto the stainless steel counter, crumpled bills, loose change, and several handwritten tabs from regular customers who still owed her money. She counted it twice, slowly and without rushing, as though the second count might produce a different number. It didn't. She sat down on a stool, pulled the paper from her apron pocket, and smoothed it flat with the edge of her hand. 30 days. She read the number on the final line again, the number she had known by heart since the week before, then folded the paper and tucked it into the bottom drawer, where she kept the things she didn't yet know what to do with. The bell above the door rang. Mrs. Ora Blackwell came in with a gust of cold air, a wool scarf wrapped 3 times around her neck, and a cloth bag of knitting supplies hanging from one hand. The owner of the laundromat across the street was 73 years old, And for more than 2 years she had taken Micah on the nights when Marin worked double shifts, so regularly that neither of them needed to mention it anymore. "Where's my boy?" she asked. Micah was already on his feet, folding the paper napkin in half and slipping it into his coat pocket before running over to wrap his arms around her waist. "I drew a 4-engine airplane, Grandma. Then tonight, you and I are going to put it on the refrigerator," Mrs. Ora said. Marin bent down and pulled his wool hat securely over his ears. "Be good." "I'm always good." The boy grinned when he said it, revealing the gap where one of his front teeth had just fallen out. Then followed Mrs. Ora to the door. Marin stood watching the 2 figures cross the street through the snow. She saw Mrs. Ora stop in the middle of the road to fasten the boy's coat. Then the 2 of them disappeared behind the brightly lit door of the laundromat. Marin went back inside, turned on the hot water, and washed the dishes one by one. When she reached the stack of cups, she did what she did every night. She washed all of them, placed them upside down on the rack, then removed a pale blue porcelain cup with a small chip along its rim from the sink and set it apart. That cup wasn't among the ones used for customers. She washed it by hand without a scouring pad, dried it with a clean towel, then reached up to the highest shelf of the cupboard and placed it exactly where it had been before, tucked into the corner where no one but her could reach it. Then she turned off the lights above the counter. Outside, the snow continued falling over the row of buildings, covering the rusted construction sign at the end of the street where a building had once stood. He first appeared on a Tuesday evening the previous fall, taking the last booth against the wall, the one Marin still called Table 7 even though it had no number at all, and from then on, he came every Tuesday night without fail. He arrived after the diner had begun to empty, took off his black wool coat and draped it over the back of the seat, then sat with his back to the wall and his face turned toward the door. He never ordered food. He never once took out his phone, read a newspaper, or looked at the television mounted in the corner near the ceiling, where some game was always playing. He merely sat there with a cup of black coffee, drinking very slowly, and gazing through the window as though he were waiting for someone they both knew would never come. The 3rd time he came in, Marin poured his coffee and set the cup down. He looked at it for a second, then said, "Bring me the blue cup." She looked up. "Which one?" "The one on the top shelf," he said. "The one with the chipped rim." Marin straightened. "That one isn't for customers." He didn't explain or plead. He only said, "I'll pay extra." She told him money couldn't buy that cup, that it was ugly, that it was chipped, and that she had 11 clean, unbroken white cups that satisfied everyone who walked through the door. He listened to all of it, nodded once as though he understood, then came back the following week and asked the exact same thing, then again the week after that, and again the week after that. On the 5th visit, Marin set the coffee pot down on the counter, planted both hands on her hips, and looked at him the way she might look at a broken faucet she had tightened 10 times only to find it still dripping. "Do you realize you're bargaining over a porcelain cup?" she said. "I do. And are you planning to give up?" "No." She stood still for several seconds, then laughed. It wasn't the polite laugh she gave customers. It rose straight from her chest, brief and genuine, the first laugh that had escaped her in that room since the winter her mother died. She fetched a stool, reached up to the highest shelf, brought down the blue cup, rinsed it with hot water, filled it, and carried it to Table 7. She set it in front of him. "There, it's chipped. Mind your lip." He studied the cup a little longer than seemed natural, longer than a man should look at his own coffee cup, then wrapped both hands around it. Marin noticed that his palms were webbed with thin white scars crossing in every direction like cracks across the surface of a frozen lake. She turned away before he could catch her staring. "Thank you," he said behind her. Just those 2 words, nothing more. From that night on, every Tuesday evening, she took the cup down before he arrived, and he never had to ask for it again. They said very little to each other. One evening, she asked what he did for a living, and he answered, "Real estate." Another evening, she remarked that it was bitterly cold outside, and he replied, "I'm used to it." He never asked her a single question, and it wasn't until much later that she understood it wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he didn't need to ask. Then, on the Tuesday evening, during the week of the season's first snow, after he rose, put on his coat, and left, Marin cleared Table 7 and found a thick, flat stack of bills folded in half beneath the blue cup, placed there with deliberate care. She counted it. Then she counted it again. It was enough to pay the diner's electric bill for 4 months. She snatched up the money, rushed to the door, flung the glass door open into the freezing air, and called out into the street. "Hey, mister, you forgot something." The sidewalk was empty. Snow was slowly filling a line of footprints leading toward the end of the street, where the rusted construction sign stood, and she remained there until the footprints had faded completely. The silver-haired man arrived on a Saturday morning when the diner had just opened and only 2 customers were sitting at the counter. He wore a gray overcoat and a fedora, and he removed his hat before crossing the threshold. That small gesture made Maren notice him before he had even said a word. He sat down in the second booth, ordered a cup of coffee, then placed a brown hardcover folder on the table. "Miss Doyle," he said. "My name is Gus Hale. I work for the Santoro family." Maren stood motionless with the coffee pot in her hand. She had heard that name since she was a child, spoken in the way people spoke of bad weather, never mentioned directly, yet understood by everyone. "What do you want?" "I want you to sit down for 10 minutes, he said. "After that you can throw me out, and I'll leave immediately." She sat down. He opened the folder, turned it around, and pushed it toward her. The first page was a copy of the loan her mother had taken out, a business loan secured by the very building that housed the diner on the ground floor. "I know what this is," Maren said. "Do you know who owns it now?" Gus asked. She said nothing. He turned to the next page. 3 weeks ago, this debt was purchased from the bank, and the buyer entered it into our organization's common ledger. He said it in the voice of an accountant reading a balance sheet, without any rise or fall in his tone. Maren stared at the paper. "Then tell your people to erase it." Gus slowly shook his head. "That is precisely what I came here to explain," he said, and then he continued in the voice of a man who had repeated a rule so many times that he could no longer recognize how unreasonable it was. "Our family has had a law since the time of the young master's grandfather, and that law has never once been broken. Anything entered into the common ledger belongs to every member of the council, not to any one man alone. The head of the family can't take money from his own pocket and remove a debt from the common ledger as a favor to an outsider. If he does, he is spending the property of 7 other men for a private purpose, and those 7 men will have the right to demand a vote on his fitness to lead before the week is over." He paused and took a sip of coffee. "But if he does nothing, this debt will be handled like every other debt in the ledger, on schedule and without leniency, and you will lose this diner in 30 days. Maren felt both her hands grow cold. "Then why are you sitting here?" "Because there is one exception," Gus said. "The law says outsiders can't be protected, but members of the family can." He turned to the final page and pushed it in front of her. It was a typed marriage agreement, brief and straightforward, lasting 12 months, with a termination clause and a provision transferring ownership of the building into her name once the agreement ended. Maren read the entire document once, then looked up, her voice gone hoarse. "You're telling me that the cheapest way to keep my mother's diner is to sell myself, aren't you?" Gus Hale didn't look away from her. He capped his pen, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and only then did he answer. "I'm telling you that someone has paid a far greater price than you so that you could still be sitting here with a choice," he said. "Do you understand me?" She didn't. He stood, put on his hat, and placed a white business card on the table, with nothing printed on it but a string of numbers. "I won't come back. Call or don't. The choice is yours." Then he walked out. Maren remained alone in the diner, her hand still resting on the document, while outside, snow had begun to fall over the sidewalk once again. The white business card lay in the bottom drawer for 4 days, beside the foreclosure notice folded into quarters, and Maren opened that drawer far more often than her work required. By Wednesday afternoon, the diner's telephone rang. The caller was the attorney handling the guardianship case, her voice calm and professional. The kind of voice belonging to someone who had to say similar things to different people every day. She explained that when the annual review came due, the court would require updated documents proving that Maren had stable housing. Because Maren was Micah's sole guardian and had no income apart from the diner, her living arrangements were always the part of the file examined most closely, and if her address changed, she would have to report it within 10 days. Maren listened, and as she did, she looked up at the ceiling, where the soft sound of footsteps moved back and forth above her, because the 2-room apartment where she and Micah lived occupied the 2nd floor of this very building. It was part of the same property her mother had pledged as collateral for the loan, the same property now listed in the common ledger of an organization whose only member she had ever met was an old man in a fedora. The attorney asked something else about a medical examination form. Maren said she would have it ready. Then she thanked her and hung up, and she remained beside the telephone for a very long time, one hand still resting on the receiver, until she realized she had finally understood something she had spent the past 4 days refusing to let herself understand. Losing the diner didn't mean merely losing the diner. Losing the diner meant losing the apartment upstairs. Losing the apartment upstairs meant leaving a blank address line in a file that some stranger would read, underline, and bring into a meeting where Maren wouldn't be allowed to sit. Since the day her sister died, there had been only one thing in this world that she had to do right. And the boy's father had walked away before Micah had even learned to walk. That evening, she closed the diner earlier than usual. She didn't turn on the lights over the dining area. She left only the small lamp above the cash register burning, then sat down on the wooden staircase leading to the second floor, on the 4th step from the bottom, the place where her mother used to sit and take off her shoes after a night shift. Gus Hale's agreement was in her hands. She had read it 4 times, and now, beneath that sickly yellow light, she read it for the 5th, one line at a time, slowly, as though this time she might discover a trap she had somehow missed during the previous 4. 12 months. There was no clause requiring them to live together. There was no clause compelling her to do anything except carry a different last name on paper for 12 months. One provision stated that, once the agreement ended, the building and all the land belonging to it would be transferred into her name, free of debt. Across the street, the laundromat door was still glowing with light, and through the diner's windows, Maren could hear Micah's laughter drifting over, breaking loose in little bursts whenever Mrs. Aura made a mess of something in the kitchen. It was the laughter of an 8-year-old child living in safety, the kind of safety he believed was natural and should have been natural. Maren sat listening until the laughter faded completely. Then she rose, walked to the cash register, and took a ballpoint pen from the cup holding the pens. She turned to the final page. She didn't read it again. She signed her name in the blank space, dark and firm, then set the pen down and stared at the signature until the ink was dry. They told her to meet them in the Civil Procedures Office in the basement of City Hall, down a low, ceilinged corridor with gray vinyl flooring, fluorescent lights with one tube flickering halfway along, and a row of blue plastic chairs against the wall where several other couples sat waiting with bouquets in their hands and phones raised to take pictures. Maren arrived later than she had intended because she had taken an extra afternoon shift to earn enough money for Micah's art class tuition, and she hadn't had time to go home and change, so her green apron was still tied around her waist beneath her coat. She sat down in the last chair, both hands resting on her thighs, and throughout the wait, she imagined nearly a dozen different versions of the man who was about to walk through the door. Not one of them was right. The corridor door opened, and the man descending the final step, removing the black wool coat with snow still clinging to its shoulders, was the same customer who sat at table 7 every Tuesday evening. Maren rose so quickly that the plastic chair slid backward with a sharp scrape across the floor. He stopped 3 steps away from her and showed no surprise, none at all, and that was what made the blood in her veins turn cold. "It's you." He didn't answer. "How long?" she asked, her voice dropping low. "How long have you known who I am?" The clerk called their names from inside the room. He inclined his head toward the door. "Let's go in." The room beyond was small, with a pressed wood desk, a flag standing in one corner, and 2 chairs. No one accompanied them. There were no flowers, no rings, and not a single phone raised to take a picture. The clerk read the required declaration in the flat voice of someone who had recited it 4,000 times, asked 2 questions, and they both answered. His voice was no louder than it was in ordinary conversation, and Maren realized that this was the first time she had ever heard him speak more than 3 words in succession. When the document was pushed across the desk, he signed first, slowly, 1 stroke at a time, and as he held the edge of the paper, she could clearly see both his palms, crisscrossed with thin white scars. Then he paused at the final page, the tip of his pen still hovering above it, and looked up at her for the first time since entering the room. "You still have the right to stand up and leave until I sign this last page." Maren looked at him. She thought of the 4th stair from the bottom, the lowest drawer, the address line in the file that some stranger would read and underline, and the sound of Micah's laughter drifting over from across the street. She remained seated. He signed. The clerk stamped the document, tore off a copy, offered a rehearsed word of congratulations, then called the next couple's names. The entire thing lasted exactly 11 minutes. When they reached the curb, A black car was already waiting with its rear door open, and Gus Hale stood beside it, removing his hat when he saw her. He offered no congratulations. He merely looked at her for a second, then bowed his head ever so slightly, and Marin couldn't read the meaning of that gesture. No one spoke in the car. Snow clung to the windows. The city drifted past in blurred streaks of light, and she sat with a cloth bag containing a few changes of clothes on her lap, while he sat on the opposite side of the seat, gazing through the window, the distance between them wide enough for a third person. The car stopped at the foot of a tower of black glass. They crossed the lobby, stepped into the elevator, and he pressed a card to the control panel. No button was pushed. The car rose with barely a sound for a very long time, so long that Marin began to hear the sound of her own breathing, while the numbers on the display continued climbing until they finally stopped at the 51st floor. Then the doors opened. She woke when daylight had already filled the room, her eyes swollen and her throat dry, and for the first moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then she remembered. She sat up, untied the apron that was still fastened around her waist, and caught a scent so familiar that it seemed absurd in this room. Freshly brewed coffee. She went outside. The coffee pot was full and still hot, resting on the kitchen counter with a white cup turned upside down beside it. No one was there. She touched the side of the pot, then drew her hand back, and she walked through the room searching for some trace of the person who had just been standing there. There was no dirty cup in the sink. There wasn't a single drop of water on the stone countertop. There was no sound behind any of the doors. The apartment was so large and silent that she could hear the soft tread of her own bare feet. And much later, when she remembered that morning, what chilled her most wasn't the emptiness, but a detail she noticed only on her second walk through. There wasn't a single framed photograph hanging on any wall in the entire place. No wedding pictures, no family photographs, no landscapes, nothing at all. It was as though the person who lived there had gone from wall to wall, taken everything down, and never hung anything up again. She poured herself a cup of coffee and drank it standing, and when she returned to the bedroom to retrieve her coat, she saw it. On the pillow beside hers, where no one had slept the night before, a small object had been placed neatly in the center. It was a brass compass about the size of her palm, its finish worn thin around the edges from being handled too often. A crack ran diagonally across the glass from one side to the other, and the needle still trembled when she tilted it. She turned it over. Engraved on the back in the fine, shallow strokes of a small tool were two initials, E.S. Not her name. Not his. She sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the compass in both hands and turning it slowly beneath the light, and she realized that the crack in the glass didn't look like the kind made when something fell to the floor. It spread outward from a single point in the center, as though someone had clenched it tightly in the palm of a hand and refused to let go. There was no note with it. Not a single word. She placed it back on the pillow, then picked it up again and slipped it into her coat pocket. In the kitchen, she opened the refrigerator because she needed a reason not to sit still. It was full. Whole milk instead of skim. Eggs, rye bread, a carton of strawberries, and a jar of orange marmalade with pieces of peel. The exact kind she always bought at the corner store because it was the only kind her mother had eaten. She stood staring into that open refrigerator longer than any ordinary person should have, then closed it. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly open. She pushed it wider. Inside was a small room with a window, and beside that window stood a drawing table with an adjustable tilted surface, the kind whose price she had looked up online twice before closing the page. On the table was a large box of colored pencils, still sealed, with every shade imaginable. Beside it lay a pad of large drawing paper. There was no note here either. No one demanded that she say thank you. Marin stood in the doorway of that room for a very long time, one hand still gripping the compass inside her coat pocket, and she realized that she was trembling. Early Monday morning, before the sky had begun to brighten, Gus Hale came to pick her up. He said the young master wanted her there, and when Marin asked why, he only replied that anyone who carried the Santoro name ought to know what sustained it. The car headed south, leaving the lighted streets behind and following the waterfront until there was nothing on either side but chain-link fences and stacks of shipping containers rising through the fog. The warehouse stood at the end of the pier, with a high ceiling and corrugated metal walls, and inside it was every bit as cold as it was outdoors. A long steel table stood in the center of the concrete floor, and 7 men were seated around it. Gus led her to a chair against the wall, about 4 steps from the table, then remained standing behind her. Marin sat down and began to watch. The 7 men ranged in age from their late 30s to their late 60s. Some wore expensive overcoats, while others wore work jackets still stained with oil, and in front of each man lay papers or an open notebook. No one was reading them. One man took out a pack of cigarettes, turned it over and over in his hand, then slipped it back into his pocket without removing one. Another glanced at his wristwatch, then immediately lowered his hand beneath the table, as though he had just done something he shouldn't have. No one spoke to anyone else. No one poured coffee from the pot waiting in the corner. The silence lasted long enough for Marin to hear water striking the concrete pilings outside, and the faint sound of some metal door tapping in the wind. She looked at the empty chair in the middle of the row, not at the head of the table, but directly in the center, and she understood that these 7 grown men were waiting, and that they had already been waiting for some time. The door opened. Rafael Santoro walked in, passed the place where she sat without stopping, removed his black wool coat and draped it over the back of the chair, then sat down. He placed his coffee cup on the steel tabletop. The sound of porcelain touching metal was very soft, but the entire room heard it, and at once, all 7 notebooks opened together. One man began reporting on the unloading schedule. The next spoke about a crane maintenance contract. Rafe listened without taking notes, occasionally giving a single nod. Then came the turn of the 4th man, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s named Reuben, who supervised the Western Yard. He read out the figures for the month, paused, then added that there was a discrepancy in the yard's accounts and that he was having the records reviewed. Rafe didn't look up immediately. He rotated his cup a quarter turn across the table. "How much is missing?" Reuben gave him a number. "Since when?" Reuben hesitated for half a beat, then said, "Since summer." Rafe placed one hand on the table and asked the 3rd question in the same voice he had used for the first 2, no louder and no colder. "Who authorized that discrepancy?" Reuben opened his mouth, closed it, and then began to speak. He spoke about a loan taken out by his wife's brother, about borrowing the money temporarily and intending to replace it, about the 2 times he had managed to put it back and the 3 times he hadn't, and about which line in the ledger he had altered in his own handwriting. No one interrupted him. No one looked at him. He told them everything in roughly the time it took for a cup of coffee to grow cold, then fell silent, both hands resting on the table, his entire body trembling almost imperceptibly. Rafe nodded. "Bring every ledger from the Western Yard here on Friday." Then he turned to the 5th man and asked about the crane maintenance schedule as though the previous 3 minutes had never happened. From her chair against the wall, Marin watched her husband and realized that throughout the entire meeting, he hadn't raised his voice once. On the way back, Gus's phone rang, and before he had listened to 3 full sentences, his eyes lifted to the rearview mirror. He said nothing to Marin. He merely told the man in the back seat that there was trouble in the North District, and Rafe answered with a single word: "Go." The car turned away from the route leading back to the tower and drove deep into a neighborhood of low houses with concrete front yards and white wooden fences whose paint had begun to peel, then stopped in front of a house with a porch and a pickup truck parked crookedly across the driveway. Rafe got out. He left the car door open, and because of that, Marin could hear almost everything from where she sat. He knocked twice. A woman opened the door, her hair tied high, wearing a long-sleeved sweater, one hand gripping the edge of the door while the other arm was folded across her chest. She looked at him, then stepped back to let him in, and in the moment she moved, Marin saw her turn her face slightly away from the porch light. A man's voice carried from inside, high and rapid, the voice of someone trying to explain something he already knew couldn't be explained. Rafe walked in and left the door open. He didn't look at the man for even a second. He went straight to the dining table, pulled out a chair, sat down, then took a folded packet of papers and a ring of keys from the inside pocket of his coat. He placed both on the table and pushed them toward the woman. "Mrs. Delaney," he said. She remained where she was. "What is this?" "The deed to this house," he replied. "As of tomorrow morning, it will be in your name." She stared at the papers without touching them. "I don't understand," Rafe said. "You don't need to understand today. You only need to know that it's here." The man stepped forward and began saying Rafe's name. He started insisting that this was a private matter between husband and wife, that every marriage had moments like this, that he could take care of it. Rafe still didn't turn his head. He folded his hands on the tabletop and spoke to the woman in a lower, slower voice. "There's a law in my family, Mrs. Delaney. It has only one line. You don't lay a hand on women, old people, or children. Anyone who does is no longer one of mine, and I don't need to hear the reason." She stood there, and it was a long time before she spoke, her voice hoarse but clear. "What about the rent from his place of business?" "I don't have a trade," Rafe said. "The rent from that place doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the house, and the house belongs to you. You have the right to rent it to anyone you choose." She looked at him for a very long time, then reached out and took the ring of keys. She closed her fingers around it and didn't open her hand. "Thank you," she said. Rafe stood, pushed the chair neatly back against the table, and only then turned toward the man standing in the middle of the room. He didn't step closer. He didn't raise his voice. He said, "You have until nightfall to leave this city." The man began talking again. Then both his knees buckled onto the wooden floor, and he said he had been with the family since he was 18, that he had nowhere else to go, that he was begging for one more chance. Rafe walked past him where he knelt and headed for the door, and he didn't say another word to him. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back at the woman. "Someone will bring you a notarized copy tomorrow morning," he said. "Don't sign anything for anyone else until you've read it carefully." Then he returned to the car. He got into his seat, closed the door, and told Gus to drive. No one in the car spoke for the rest of the journey. Maren sat staring at the hands resting on the knees of the man she had just married. Those hands crisscrossed with white scars that had pushed a packet of papers across another family's dining table. And for the first time since the day she signed the agreement, she understood that the things the entire city whispered about him weren't fiction. He truly was a man who could take everything from another human being with a single sentence, and he had just done exactly that without ever leaving his chair. That evening, Maren asked Gus to stop by the diner so she could pick up the order book, and on her way back out, she saw the black car parked at the end of the street, beyond the construction fence. She asked Gus to stop some distance away, and he did without asking why. At the end of Cortlandt Row, where the red brick street came to an abrupt end, a vacant lot the size of an entire city block stood enclosed by a rusted chain-link fence, with a faded sign bearing the name of a construction company that had long since gone out of business. Inside the fence, nothing remained but a bare concrete foundation, a few low sections of wall still standing at the back, and weeds that had pushed through the cracks and withered over the passing seasons. Now all of it lay beneath a thin, even layer of snow, as though someone had draped cloth over the furniture in a house where no one lived anymore. Just outside the fence, on the sidewalk, stood the only maple tree that had survived, its trunk rough and gnarled, its bare branches reaching into the night sky. Rafe stood beneath that tree. He wasn't wearing an overcoat, only a dark shirt, and snow was settling on both his shoulders, but he didn't brush it away. In his hands was a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. He stood there for a very long time, so long that Maren began to feel cold even inside the sealed car. Then he bent down and placed the flowers at the base of the tree, turning the bouquet until it rested neatly, and straightening one broken stem. He placed one hand against the trunk. He didn't bow his head, make the sign of the cross, or recite anything. He simply stood there with his hand resting on the bark, his face turned toward the vacant ground beyond the fence, while the snow continued to fall. Then he withdrew his hand, turned, walked back to his car, and drove away without once crossing through the chain-link gate on the south side, which had been secured with a chain for years. "He doesn't go inside. He never has," Gus said quietly from the driver's seat, and those were the only words he spoke for the rest of the journey home. Maren didn't ask anything else. When she returned to the 51st floor, the apartment was still dark and silent, just as it had been that morning. No one had arrived before her. She hung up her coat, then reached into the pocket and took out the compass. She sat beneath the only table lamp in the room, switched it on, and turned the object over in her hands once more. The brass had developed a dark, polished patina where it had been touched most often, the kind of sheen that could only come from human skin brushing against it thousands of times. She tilted it closer to the lamp and examined the crack in the glass. It wasn't a single straight line. It spread from a point near the center, dividing into 4 branches that ran in 4 different directions, and around that point, the glass was very slightly indented, almost impossible to see unless it was held beneath the light. Maren closed her hand around it, bringing her fingers together, and she understood what kind of force could have made a crack like that. It hadn't fallen to the floor. It hadn't struck a wall. A hand had clenched around it and refused to let go. She turned it over again, tilting it back and forth until the two initials became clear beneath the light. E.S. She sat there for a very long time with the compass in her palm, and only one question remained in her mind. Who was E.S.? At the end of the hallway was a door Maren had never opened. She had passed it every day, had always seen it closed, and had told herself that in a home without a single framed photograph, there must also be doors that weren't meant for her. But that evening, after sitting for far too long with the compass in her hand, she rose, walked down the hallway, and placed her hand on the doorknob. It wasn't locked. The room beyond was dark, and the only light came from the city through an uncurtained window, enough for her to make out a large shape draped in white cloth at the center of the room. She switched on the light. It was a piano. The covering was thick and ivory white, falling all the way to the floor on all four sides, and there wasn't a single speck of dust on it. That meant someone still came into this room, still cleaned it, still dusted it, yet never pulled that cloth away. Maren stepped closer. The music stand rose above the covering, and an open book of sheet music still rested on it, the outer edges of its pages yellowed with age. She leaned down to look, without touching it. Several notes had been written in pencil along the margin of the left page, in the quick, slanting handwriting of a young person. One passage had been crossed out and rewritten. Another had been marked with an exclamation point. Someone had been practicing this piece. Someone had stopped halfway through and meant to return the next day. She straightened, and that was when she heard footsteps behind her. Rafe stood in the doorway. He didn't enter the room. He didn't tell her to get out, and he didn't ask who had given her permission to open the door. He simply stood there, still holding his car keys in one hand, his eyes fixed past her shoulder on the white covering, and Maren saw his jaw tighten, then slowly release. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to." "I know," he replied. The silence lasted long enough for her to count 3 beats of her own heart. Then he spoke, and his voice sounded unlike anything she had ever heard from him. "My younger brother." Maren turned fully toward him. "He was 19, Rafe said. "He was never involved in my work, not once." He paused and looked down at the keys in his hand. "I paid a great deal of money to make sure he never had to be. His schooling, his home, everything was under other people's names. Everything kept completely separate. All he knew was this piano. She wanted to ask his brother's name. She wanted to ask what had happened. She wanted to ask whether the 2 initials engraved on the back of the compass in the pocket of her coat, hanging in the hallway, belonged to him. But she saw the way Rafe stood at the threshold without crossing it. The way he looked at the white covering as though it were something he wasn't permitted to approach, and she understood that every question she asked now would become a door she closed in her own face. So she only said, "Was he good?" Rafe was silent for a very long time. "Better than anything I've ever done in my life," he said. Then he reached into the room and switched off the light, and the room returned to the muted glow rising from the city below. He waited for her to step into the hallway. Then he closed the door slowly, until the latch settled into place, and kept his hand on the knob for 1 more second before letting go. The next morning, Gus Hale arrived earlier than usual, and when Maren reached the lobby, he was standing beside the car with 2 paper cups of coffee in his hands. He handed one to her. She took it, and instead of opening the car door, she asked him the question she had carried inside her all night. "Mr. Hale, what happened at the end of Cortlandt Row?" Gus looked at her for a long time. Then he set his coffee on the hood, leaned back against the side of the car, and told her. He said there had once been a building there, a red brick structure, 6 floors high with 32 apartments, and a shoe repair shop on the ground floor. Most of the people who lived there had been there for decades, and on a night near the end of winter, 6 winters ago, the building came down. He said the number 9. 9 people. He spoke slowly, separating every word, as though each time he said that number, he still had to stop and breathe. Among those 9 were Rafe's mother, Rosalind, and his younger brother. Maren set her coffee on the hood beside his, because her hands had begun to lose their steadiness. Gus looked toward the stream of traffic moving past them. He said the snow had fallen heavily that night, that the lights from the rescue vehicles had swept red, then white, then red again across the faces of the buildings on both sides of the street from midnight until morning, that barricades had been stretched across both ends, and that the entire neighborhood had stood beyond them in silence. Then he said there had been one person who hadn't remained outside. He went in during the first hour, Gus said, and he worked with his bare hands. No gloves, no tools, because none of the equipment had arrived yet. He lifted the rubble away one piece at a time, one after another, and the snow kept falling, covering every place he had just cleared. They told him to stop. He didn't listen. Near dawn, 4 men had to pull him out, and I mean they truly had to pull him, he said. They didn't help him walk. He fell silent for a while. Then he added, "You've seen his hands, haven't you?" Marin nodded, unable to speak. "That's where those scars came from," Gus said. He picked up his coffee, took one sip, then set it down again without drinking any more. He went on to tell her that less than a week after the funeral, the newspapers began digging into the story, that a local paper published a long article beneath a bold headline stretching across the entire width of the front page, and that the headline placed Rafe's name beside those 9 deaths. More stories came after that, he said. The radio repeated it. People taped copies to store windows all along the street. Someone painted the words across the construction fence. And in all the 6 winters since that night, I haven't once seen him correct a single word. He didn't sue anyone. He didn't answer any interviews. He didn't ask a lawyer to send so much as one letter. Once, I wrote a correction myself and left it on his desk. He read the whole thing, folded it, handed it back to me, and said, "Thank you, Mr. Gus." Then he said nothing else. Marin looked at him. "Why?" she asked. "Why didn't he defend himself?" Gus Hale turned toward her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw the silver-haired man lower his eyes before a question. "Because in his own mind, he truly is guilty," he said. "Just not of the thing they printed in the newspapers." He picked up his hat and put it on, opened the car door for her, and didn't say another word for the rest of that morning. That weekend, the attorney called again and asked her to submit a copy of the ownership papers for the building that housed the diner before the review date. Marin called Gus, and Gus told her that every document related to her had been moved to the apartment and placed in the safe in the study. Then he read her the combination. She went up to the 51st floor that afternoon, when no one else was home. The study was near the end of the hallway, and the safe was built into the wall behind a wooden cabinet door. She entered the combination. The safe opened onto a compartment, divided into 3 horizontal sections. In the middle section was the familiar brown folder, exactly what she needed. She pulled it out, tucked it beneath her arm, and was about to close the safe when her hand brushed the edge of the bottom section, and it slid outward. She bent down and looked inside. There was no money, no paperwork, nothing resembling the sort of thing people kept in the safe of a tower apartment. There were only 2 objects. The first was a shallow glass frame, the kind used to preserve specimens, lying face up. Inside it, pressed flat between 2 panes of glass, was a faded piece of cotton cloth, its edges worn through, one corner torn away in an uneven line. Marin lifted it with both hands. In one corner of the cloth, embroidered in thread that had faded almost completely but could still be read, were 5 capital letters. D-O-Y-L-E-S. She knew this piece of cloth. She knew the entire bolt it had been cut from. Her mother used to buy fabric by the bolt from the kitchen supply store on Halsted Street, cut it into square dish towels, then sit and embroider the diner's name into one corner of each one during slow evenings. She had done it for years, until her hands could no longer hold a needle. There were still about 20 towels just like it in the diner's kitchen, but this one had a corner torn away, and none of the towels in the diner's kitchen were torn like that. She turned the glass frame over. There was nothing written on the back. No date, no name, not a single word. The second object lay beside it, also preserved in a smaller glass frame. It was a recipe card made of thin cardstock, about the size of her hand, ruled with lines, yellowed around the edges, with a round oil stain in the lower right corner. The handwriting slanted to the right. The O's were round, and the T's were crossed higher than usual, and Marin didn't need to read the whole thing to know whose handwriting it was. Apple pie. Make the crust with lard, not butter. Add the cinnamon while the apples are still hot. On the final line, her mother had added a sentence in smaller writing. If the crust shrinks, it's because you kneaded it too long. Don't blame the oven. Marin had searched for this card. She had gone through every drawer in the diner's kitchen, had emptied the tin recipe box 3 separate times, and had finally concluded that it must have been packed into one of the boxes sold for almost nothing during the estate sale after the funeral, when she had signed papers in such a state that she could barely remember what she'd signed. She stood there in the study of a man she had known for less than 2 months, holding the 2 glass frames in her hands, unable to move. There was no explanation for why these two objects were in that man's safe. There was no explanation for why they had been preserved beneath glass and kept in the lowest compartment, alongside the things people locked away because they were afraid of losing them. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. Then she returned both frames to exactly where they had been, pushed the compartment closed, shut the safe, turned the lock, and stood with her back against the wooden cabinet door until her breathing became steady again. That Sunday, the diner was closed, and Marin brought Micah up to the 51st floor for the first time. The boy went straight to the room at the end of the hallway where the drafting table stood. He studied its adjustable surface for a moment, then turned and asked, "Aunt Marin, this can be adjusted, right?" When Marin nodded, he climbed onto the chair and sat there for nearly an hour without needing to be reminded once. By noon, he announced that everyone was having pancakes because Grandma Aura made pancakes every Sunday, and he had learned exactly how to make them. Rafe was sitting at the dining table with a stack of papers. He looked up. The boy looked at him and asked, "Do you know how to make pancakes?" "No," he replied. "Then come over here," Micah said. "I'll teach you." Marin was about to intervene when she saw Rafe fold the papers, set them aside, and rise to his feet. The boy took command from beginning to end. He made Rafe stand in exactly the right spot in front of the stove and put the skillet in his hands, while he stood on a stool beside him so he could reach the cooktop. He said the batter had to be stirred until all the lumps were gone, but it couldn't be overmixed. That was what Grandma Aura always said. If you mixed it too much, the pancakes turned tough. He said to pour the batter into the center of the skillet and then count. And when bubbles appeared all across the surface, it was time to flip it. "Did you count?" "I counted." "You counted wrong," the boy said. "You counted too fast." When the first pancake was flipped, one side was dark brown. Micah stared at it, then burst out laughing, doubling over against the arm of the stool as he said, "It's all right, Uncle Rafe. The first one always goes wrong. It happens to Grandma Aura, too." The second pancake came out even darker than the first, and by then the boy was laughing so hard that he had to sit all the way down on the stool. Rafe stood looking at the skillet in his hand for a moment. Then he began to laugh, too. It wasn't loud. It was only a short sound that broke free from somewhere inside his chest, faded, then escaped again. The laughter of a man who hadn't used it in so long that he no longer remembered how to keep its rhythm. Marin was standing at the sink with a sponge in her hand, and she stopped completely. She had never heard that sound from this man before. The third pancake came out evenly golden. Micah declared it a success and gave his uncle permission to make the rest. While the batter rested, the boy opened a kitchen cabinet to look for powdered sugar, and on the middle shelf, he spotted a square, dark blue tin of butter cookies. He cried out, "Aunt Marin, these are the ones, the kind she sends me." Marin turned around. "What kind?" "The ones in the square blue tin," the boy said. "They're at the diner every Saturday. You keep them on top of the refrigerator." "I thought they came from Grandma Aura." After saying that, Micah turned back to the bowl of batter and gave the matter no further thought. But Marin stood motionless with the sponge still in her hand. A tin of those cookies had appeared at the diner's back door every Saturday morning for more than 2 years, without an invoice, without the sender's name, and she had assumed they came from some kind-hearted regular customer. Once, she had asked several people, but no one claimed them, and eventually she stopped asking. She turned to look at the man standing in front of the stove with the skillet in his hand and his sleeves rolled to his elbows. But he didn't look at her. Lunch that day consisted of 11 pancakes, 2 of them burned black and set apart on a separate plate by Micah, who called them the evidence. Before they ate, the boy made both of them stand beside the plate of evidence, held up his aunt's phone, and took a picture. The photograph was slightly blurred, the frame crooked, and Rafe hadn't had time to prepare, so his face was still turned partly to one side. That afternoon, Marin had it printed at the shop down the street and left it on the kitchen counter. By the end of the following week, she saw that it had been framed and hung on the hallway wall. It was the only photograph in the entire home. He came on a Thursday afternoon, when only 2 tables in the diner were occupied, and Marin was wiping down the counter. The bell over the door rang, and the man who entered was in his mid-50s, with silver hair combed straight back, a camel hair coat, and shoes polished to a shine, even though the sidewalk outside was covered with salt to keep people from slipping. He removed his gloves one at a time, folded them, placed them on the table, then sat down in the second booth and ordered a cup of tea. Marin brought it to him. He thanked her by name, and she stopped. "Have we met?" "No," he said. I'm Sterling Voss. He spoke the name the way someone might recite the name of a major street, without emphasis, simply assuming the other person had heard it before. He asked about the illuminated sign outside with one broken stroke, said he knew someone who could repair it in half a day without charging anything, then complimented the smell of the coffee, and then said he was very sorry about her mother. Marin straightened. What do you want? Voss set down his teacup. From inside his coat, he withdrew a long envelope and a thin gray folder, placed both on the table, and pushed the envelope toward her. Inside was a check. She didn't pick it up, but she saw the amount, and she had to look twice to make sure she had counted the digits correctly. What is this? An offer, he said. Your husband is holding a piece of land he doesn't use, doesn't build on, doesn't lease, doesn't do anything with, and I have a project that requires that precise parcel. I've made him an offer 4 times over the past 6 winters. All 4 times, he refused without giving me a reason. I thought perhaps it was time to try speaking with someone more capable of listening. Marin said, You've come to the wrong person. I have no say in his affairs. He smiled, and the smile was so polite that it sent a chill down her spine. You do, he said. You just don't know it yet. Then he touched one finger to the gray folder and pushed it toward her. As for this, I'm not selling anything, he said. This is a gift. Open it whenever you wish, or don't open it at all. He rose, put his gloves back on, and left payment for the tea on the table, along with just enough extra not to be considered generous. When he reached the door, he stopped with one hand on the handle and turned back to look at her. Miss Doyle, he said, you should ask him who put up that building before it came down. Then the bell rang again, and he was gone. Marin remained where she was until the customers at the final 2 tables had left, then locked the door, turned the sign to the side that said closed, sat down in the second booth, and opened the folder. There wasn't much inside. Only 4 sheets, copies made from old documents, their edges darkened by the shadow of the photocopier. The first page was a material statement in table form, ruled by hand, listing each structural component, along with its specifications, and the quantities ordered. In the column on the right, several entries had been crossed out and overwritten in a different ink, with lower specifications and smaller quantities. The second and third pages were the same. The final page was an authorization sheet. In the lower right corner, above the printed line identifying the developer, was a handwritten signature in blue ink, broad and decisive, with a capital R whose flourish swept downward, followed by a period and then the surname, R. Santoro. Marin stared at that signature for a very long time. She thought of the glass frame in the lowest compartment of the safe. She thought of the bouquet of white chrysanthemums placed beneath the maple tree in the snow. She thought of 2 scarred hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup. Then she closed the folder, and she sat alone in the darkened diner until both her legs had gone numb. She waited for him to come home that evening, and she handed him the folder right there in the middle of the hallway, without sitting down, without saying a word first. He took it, turned to the final page, and looked at the signature for exactly 3 seconds before closing it. He didn't ask who had given it to her. He didn't say it was a forgery. He didn't say anything at all. It was that silence that made her begin to tremble. Talk to me, she said. Just say one thing. That's all. Rafe stood there with the folder in his hand, and she saw his jaw tighten, exactly as it had that day when he stood at the threshold of the room at the end of the hallway. Then he said, You should get some rest. Marin heard her own voice break. She asked how many things there were in this home that she wasn't allowed to know. She asked why his safe held things that had belonged to her mother. She asked why she had stood behind that counter for 2 whole years without knowing who was leaving those tins of cookies at the back door. She asked who she was in all of this. A name on a piece of paper or something he had planned from the beginning. He listened to every word. He didn't interrupt her once. And when she finished, he remained standing exactly where he was, and he didn't answer a single one of her questions. The next morning, she folded her clothes into the old canvas bag. She went into the room with the drafting table, where Micah was sitting and finishing the wing of his airplane. Let's go home. Just you and me, she said. The boy asked if he could bring the box of colored pencils. She said he could. Then let's go, he said. But does Grandma Aura know yet? I have to go show her this tonight. He put the pencils back into the box, counted them to make sure they were all there, tucked the drawing pad beneath his arm, and to him, that day was nothing more than a morning spent packing up to go home. In the parking garage beneath the building, Gus opened the trunk, and Rafe stood several paces away without a coat, both hands in his trouser pockets. He didn't come closer. He didn't try to stop her. He waited until Micah had climbed into the car and closed the door. Then he said one thing to Marin, his voice so quiet that only she could hear it. "You read exactly what they wanted you to read." She stopped. She waited. She waited for the next sentence, for a name, an explanation, a single word she could hold on to. He said nothing more. He nodded to Gus, turned away, and walked into the elevator. The doors closed. That night, he returned home after it had grown late. The scent of flour and butter from Sunday still lingered in the kitchen. He walked past the counter and stopped in front of the refrigerator. There, fastened with 4 pieces of tape at the corners, was a large sheet of drawing paper. The 4-engine airplane had been completely colored in with a blue pencil, with windows running along its body, and a separate little window at the tail. Beneath it, written in red-colored pencil in large letters spaced unevenly apart, was a message. For Uncle Rafe. "This is a 4-engine airplane, the biggest kind. I added a window at the tail for you to sit beside, because you can see the whole wing from there. Next time, if you count slowly, the pancakes won't burn. Signed, Micah." He stood in front of the refrigerator for a very long time. He didn't take the drawing down. He didn't touch it. He simply stood there in the darkened kitchen, and that sheet of paper remained exactly where it was throughout the weeks that followed, through everything that was about to happen. No one took it down. No one mentioned it. That Wednesday afternoon, Grandma Aura came to pick Micah up earlier than usual because the two of them were planning to bake gingerbread cookies, and Marin stood in the doorway watching the boy cross the street with his box of colored pencils tucked beneath one arm. She saw him turn and wave twice before he disappeared behind the brightly lit door of the laundromat. Then she went back inside to finish the evening shift. The last customer left late. She turned the sign to the side that said closed, secured the upper bolt, then went into the kitchen and set the cast-iron skillet on the stove to fry herself some eggs for dinner, the heavy skillet her mother had used for 20 years and had never allowed anyone to wash with soap. She was waiting for the oil to heat when she heard glass breaking at the front of the diner. It wasn't a dropped drinking glass. It was the entire glass door, shattering with one long crack before cascading onto the tile floor. Marin turned off the stove. She heard shoes grinding over broken glass. One person, then 2, then 3. Someone spoke quietly. "Check the back." She lifted the cast-iron skillet with both hands and backed against the wall separating the kitchen from the dining area. The diner's kitchen had only one entrance and one other door in the farthest corner, the thick, steel-clad door of the walk-in freezer, and between her and that door lay roughly 4 steps of open space. The first man's shadow came around the corner. Marin didn't wait. She swung the skillet level with her body, and it struck the edge of the steel work table just as the man slipped through. The crash of metal against metal exploded through the narrow kitchen like a gunshot. The rack holding the cookware was knocked over. An entire stack of pots spilled across the floor, and the man stepped back to avoid everything rolling beneath his feet. She had her 4 steps. She lunged forward, pulled the freezer door handle, slipped inside, and slammed the door shut behind her. She turned the bolt from within. The door was 4 inches thick and lined with rubber, and the instant it sealed, every sound outside was swallowed whole. All that remained was the steady hum of the compressor overhead and the sound of her own breathing. Someone yanked the handle outside, then yanked it again. Then came the pounding against the door, rapid at first, gradually growing farther apart. Marin stood between shelves stacked with boxes of ingredients, the cold settling over her bare arms, and realized that her phone was lying on the counter outside beside the order book. She looked around. On the left wall, running from the ceiling down into the corner, was a pipe from the refrigeration system. The steel pipe, the maintenance man always said, ran all the way from the freezer to the machinery box in the alley behind the diner. She took the iron ladle hanging from the shelf and began striking the pipe. 3 short taps, 3 long taps, 3 short taps. She paused, then repeated them. She kept doing it in that cold, steadily, neither faster nor slower, counting silently between each round so she wouldn't have to think about anything else. She thought of Grandma Aura across the street, with the gingerbread cookie oven turned on. She thought of the drawing of the 4-engine airplane. She kept tapping. After several dozen rounds, she could no longer feel her fingertips, and at some point she heard a completely different sound outside, running footsteps. someone shouting a brief command, the back door being kicked open. Then came 3 firm knocks against the freezer door, and an older man's voice called her name. "Miss Doyle, it's me." Marin placed her hand on the bolt and had to try twice before she could turn it. The door opened, and Gus Hale stood there without his fedora, his silver hair disheveled. Behind him, 2 men from the organization were setting the fallen rack upright. He immediately took off his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. She wasn't sure whether she was answering him or herself. He helped her into the dining area, and as they walked, she saw that nothing remained of the glass front door, but an empty frame bordered by sharp fragments. Snow was blowing inside and melting across the tile floor, while outside, on the other side of the street, the laundromat door was still brightly lit, still closed, and laughter could still be heard within. The next morning, workers came to install a new pane of glass, and Marin sat in the second booth with a cup of cold coffee in her hand, watching 2 men measure the frame. Gus Hale sat across from her, and he was telling her something she didn't want to hear. "They knew you stayed here alone on Wednesday nights," he said. "They knew the boy wouldn't be here. They knew what time you locked the door. Knew you'd be in the kitchen instead of behind the counter. Knew the back door bolt had been sticking since fall." He placed one hand on the table. "No one watches a diner for 3 straight weeks just to learn that much, Miss Doyle," someone told them. Marin looked toward the door. Across the street, the laundromat still hadn't opened, even though it was long past its usual opening time. She stood, crossed the street, and knocked. Grandma Aura opened the door after a long while. She was still wearing the sweater she'd worn the day before. Her hair hadn't been combed, and she wouldn't look Marin in the eye. "Come inside," she said. Inside, the dryers stood motionless. Not one of them was running. Grandma Aura sat down on the wooden chair beside the counter, rested both hands in her lap, then clasped them together. "I heard about last night," she said. "I heard when the sirens started." Then she fell silent. Marin was about to tell her that everything was all right, but Grandma Aura looked up, and her eyes were completely red. "A man came here," she said, "about 3 weeks ago. He was wearing a gray suit and an identification badge with his picture on it. He said he was an appraiser from the bank, and that he was reviewing the loan records for the diner across the street. He told me the bank needed to determine whether the diner was truly operating, whether it had enough customers, whether the owner worked hard, because if those things could be proven, they would extend the loan." Grandma Aura had to stop there to catch her breath. "He asked so gently," she continued. "He asked what time you opened, what time you closed, whether it was the same every week, whether anyone worked with you, which nights you stayed alone, when the boy usually came over here with me. I answered everything. I answered every question, and I even told him things he hadn't asked. I told him you worked double shifts, 6 days a week. I told him you hadn't taken a single day off since your mother's funeral. I thought I was helping you. I thought I was saying good things about you so they wouldn't take the diner away." The moment she finished, she began to cry, the way old people sometimes cry, without a sound, with only their shoulders trembling. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Marin stood there, and for one very brief moment, she felt anger rise all the way into her throat. Then she looked at the hands clasped tightly in the lap of that 73-year-old woman, the hands that had buttoned her nephew's coat in the middle of the street beneath the falling snow, that had turned on the oven to bake gingerbread cookies on the very night the window shattered across the street, and the anger receded as quickly as it had risen. She stepped forward, lowered herself onto one knee before the chair, and wrapped her arms around the old woman. Grandma Aura wept into her shoulder. "It wasn't you," Marin said. "Listen to me. The person at fault is the one who took advantage of your kindness to me. You didn't do anything wrong. You only cared about me. Keep caring about me that way. Don't change because of people like them." The 2 women remained that way for a long while in the silent laundromat, where none of the machines were running. And beyond the glass door, across the street, the 2 workers were lifting the new pane of glass from the ground. That afternoon, Marin brought the gray folder to Gus Hale's table, opened it to the final page, and placed her finger on the signature in blue ink. He looked at it, then closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he looked older than he had that morning. "I knew this day would come," he said. "Sit down, Miss Doyle." He poured her a cup of coffee before he began. He told her that the building at the end of Cortlandt Street hadn't been built by Rafe. It had gone up before Rafe was even old enough to attend school. And the developer, whose name appeared on the records at the time, was his father. He paused. His father's name was Rafael Santoro. Marin's head snapped up. Father and son had the same name, Gus said. At home, they called the son Rafe, so no one would confuse them. But on paper, both of them signed their names R. Santoro, and the way they wrote the letter R was so similar that even I had to look twice. He touched the folder. This is the materials statement from when construction began. You see those entries that were crossed out and overwritten? Those are lower specifications and smaller quantities. The old man did that. He cut back, substituted cheaper materials, pocketed the difference, and convinced himself no one would die because he had done the calculations. Marin asked if Rafe had known. Gus looked directly into her eyes. He knew, he said. He found these papers in the old man's safe after his father's funeral, years before the building collapsed. And this is the part I hope you'll hear all the way through before you pass judgment on anyone. He didn't order another inspection. He read these pages, understood what they meant, then put them away and left everything as it was. 32 apartments had tenants living in them. The rent was cheaper than anywhere else in the city, and if he had the building inspected, the city would have sealed it off, and every one of those people would have had to move out within a month, with nowhere else to go. He told himself he would reinforce it section by section, quietly, working from the inside out. And he really did begin, but he moved too slowly. Gus spoke the final sentence very softly. There. That's the guilt he accepts as his own, Miss Doyle. Not the crime they wrote about in the newspapers. The guilt he carries is that he knew and still chose the slower way. Marin sat in silence for a very long time. Then she asked, "Who gave these papers to Sterling Voss?" "The uncle," Gus said. "Warwick Santoro, the old man's younger brother. He was the one who kept the originals all these years. Kept them precisely because that signature could be read as belonging to either the father or the son. To him, it wasn't evidence. It was a bridle." "Then why didn't Rafe say anything?" Marin asked. "Just one sentence. All he had to say was that it was his father's signature." Gus rested his hand on the lid of his cup. "Because if he said it, the entire city would know what the old man had done," he said. "The only man who ever taught him that women, old people, and children were not to be touched, the single rule he has kept to this day, was that same man. He would rather let people put his own name on the construction fence than allow that name to be dragged into the open. 6 winters. Not one word. Then Gus told her one more thing, something he had hesitated over all afternoon. "There's something else," he said, "and I think you should know it before you decide what to do. When your mother was in the hospital, the entire cost of her treatment was covered through a patient assistance fund with no name and no contact records. Your mother kept asking, but the hospital couldn't tell her who it was." Marin set her coffee cup on the table, and she didn't take her hand away from it again. "For how long?" she asked. "From the first day until the last," Gus said. Marin didn't tell Gus what she intended to do. She went to the branch library on Damon Street 3 mornings in a row, sat before the microfilm reader, and traced everything the city had ever printed about that building. She didn't read the accusations. She read the parts no one had bothered to read. The final pages, the appendices, the lines listing administrative procedures. And there, in a brief notice published before any of it had happened, she found a name beneath the heading for structural safety certification. Inspector Arthur Pell. It took her another 2 days to find him. He had retired and was living in a row of low houses on the west side, in the last one, with a wicker chair on the front porch and an oxygen tank beside the door. The man who answered was old and thin, breathing in short gasps, with a few wisps of white hair still clinging to his head. He wore a cardigan buttoned all the way to his throat, even though the heat was on inside. He studied her for a moment, then asked her name. She told him. He asked what she was to the Santoro family. She said she was Rafe's wife. The old man remained in the doorway for several more seconds, then stepped aside and invited her in. There was only one armchair in the house, one low table, and a television that wasn't on. On the mantel lay a sealed yellow envelope, stamped, already addressed to its recipient, and covered in a thin layer of dust. He sat down and drew one long breath before he could speak. "Sit down. I've been waiting a long time for you. Not you in particular, but anyone." He told the story very slowly, stopping often. And each time he stopped, he pressed a hand to his chest before continuing. He said that he really had inspected the building, that he had gone as high as the 4th floor, had seen what needed to be seen, and had written a report ordering the apartments vacated so the structure could be reinforced. He said that report had never been submitted. He said someone came to see him the day before it was due, a very well-dressed man who spoke with impeccable courtesy and never once threatened him. The man merely talked about how expensive college tuition had become and about how his daughter had just been accepted that year. He reached for the envelope on the mantel and placed it on the table before her. "Inside this is my original report," he said. "There's a bank statement showing the money deposited into my account, and there's a recording of our second conversation, the one when I managed to turn on the recorder in time. His name is on it, his full name, Sterling Voss." Maren reached toward the envelope, then stopped. "Why didn't you send it?" The old man gave a quiet laugh that made him cough. "I put the stamp on it 4 years ago," he said. "But where was I supposed to send it? He was already several moves ahead of me with the courts. I called the police once. They made an appointment for me to come in and give a statement, but no one ever called me back." He looked at her. "So I have only one condition. You may take this, but you must read it somewhere crowded. Somewhere many people can hear it at the same time, where there are cameras and people recording everything. Don't take it into any closed room. In closed rooms, documents disappear. Do you understand?" Maren nodded and lifted the envelope with both hands. When she reached the door, he called after her. "Miss Doyle." She turned around. "Tell him something for me," he said. "Tell him I waited 6 winters for someone willing to ask me that question." 3 days later, when Maren called his home number to ask about one more detail, his daughter answered and told her that he had died the night before in his sleep. She carried the yellow envelope up to the 51st floor that evening, and she found him on the rooftop, standing beside the railing without a coat. In a cold he seemed unable to feel. She placed the envelope on the concrete between them and said, "Arthur Pell asked me to tell you that he waited 6 winters for someone willing to ask him that question." Rafe looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up. He stood there for a very long time, and then he began to speak, saying more than everything she had ever heard from him put together. He told her that his phone had rung late that night, and the caller was his mother. She lived on the 3rd floor of that building, in the corner apartment, and she had lived there since he was a boy. He had asked her to move many times. He had already bought her another place in a quieter neighborhood and placed the keys directly in her hand, and each time she had returned them with the same answer. "This is the home your father built with his own hands. I'm not going anywhere." That night, she called to say that a crack had just appeared in the kitchen wall, running from the ceiling downward, that she could hear something inside the wall, and that she wanted to know whether the cold weather might be causing it. He told her to put on her coat, go downstairs, and wait outside. She said she wasn't going anywhere in the middle of the night, that he should send someone over to look at it and she would wait. He called 2 repairmen. Both were far away and needed more than an hour to get there. And while he was making those calls, Elias rose from his chair in the next room. Rafe stopped there. He gripped the railing with both hands. He said, "Let me go," Rafe said. "He told me her building was only 15 minutes away, that he would drive over, check on her, and call me right back. All his life, I kept him away from everything. His school, his home, his paperwork. I separated him from this name in every way I knew how. And that night was the first time he ever asked me to let him do something useful for me." He stood there, 19 years old, still holding his car keys, waiting for my answer. He fell silent for a long while. "I said yes," he said. The building collapsed before dawn. Maren couldn't speak. He continued, his voice flat, as though he were reading from a list. He spoke of the long hours that night, of how they had to drag him away, of how afterward he didn't go home but walked and kept walking without knowing where he was going, with a piece of paper bearing an address in his coat pocket. It was the address of the inspector who had signed the building's safety certificate. "I wasn't going there to ask him any questions," he said. "You understand what I meant to do." He said he couldn't remember how far he had walked. He remembered only that the snow was falling heavily, and that at some point his legs could no longer hold him up. So he sat down on a concrete step in an alley behind a diner, between several metal trash cans and a wall light that had burned out long ago. Then the back door opened. A young woman stepped outside carrying 2 bags of garbage. "She saw me," he said. "She saw a strange man sitting in the alley behind her diner near dawn, in a condition that would have made any sane person close the door and call the police. She didn't call. She stood there looking at me for a while, then went back inside. I thought that was the end of it. But she came out again. and she was holding a cup of coffee. A blue ceramic cup with a chip missing from the rim. She set it on the step beside me. Then she took a dish towel from the pocket of her apron, tore it in half with her teeth, and wrapped my hands, one at a time, without asking me a single question. When she was finished, she sat down on the step beside me. She didn't say anything. She simply sat there until morning. Then she stood to go inside and prepare to open the diner, and before she went in, she said exactly one thing to me. Rafe turned and looked at her for the first time since he had begun telling the story. "No one is just the worst night of their life," he said. "Drink it before it gets cold." Marin let go of the railing. She heard her own voice echo inside her mind, the voice she had possessed 6 winters earlier. And she saw that step again, that trash can, the smell of snow mingling with the smell of cold frying oil. She had told her mother about it that morning as though it were some small, unimportant incident, and within a week she had forgotten it. He continued, and at last his voice broke. "I walked out of the room on our wedding night because I had owed you for 6 winters, he said. "If I had stayed, you would have thought you had a debt to repay. I wanted you to have exactly what you gave me in that alley, the right to choose for yourself." Warwick Santoro called the council together on Friday morning, 3 days before the public hearing on Sterling Voss's project, and he chose the warehouse at the harbor as the meeting place. He took the center chair in the row before anyone else arrived, and when Rafe walked in, he didn't stand. The other 7 men sat in silence. Warwick spoke briefly. He said the house had endured a bad year, that its head had allowed a private matter to disrupt the entire table, that someone had dared to break into an establishment listed in the common ledger, and no one had yet been able to explain why, and that the time had come to vote on his standing. When he finished, he opened both hands like a man who had done everything he could. Rafe didn't argue. He placed a thick stack of ledgers on the steel table, 8 leather-bound volumes arranged in 2 stacks of 4. Then he opened the top one and pushed it toward the man sitting closest to him. "Look," he said. The 7 men lowered their heads. Inside were 6 winters' worth of handwritten records. Every payment was listed separately, with its date, its source, and its amount. One by one, the operations that had sustained the house for years had either been cut away or reduced. One stream of income withdrawn, another shut down, and in the corresponding column on the right was where the money had gone. Tuition, medical bills, rent paid on someone else's behalf, funeral expenses, 9 names, year after year, without a single month missed. There wasn't a sender's name on any line. The 4th man at the table, Reuben, turned the pages faster than the others, and when he reached the 3rd volume, he stopped, looked up at Rafe, then lowered his eyes again. Warwick said none of this was relevant. Rafe said it was. He stood straight with both hands resting on the table. "If you want this chair, take it," he said. "I won't hold on to it. But whoever sits there must continue paying the debt recorded in these 8 ledgers, every month, until it is paid in full. Anyone willing to take my place on that condition, raise your hand." The warehouse became so quiet that the water could be heard lapping against the concrete pilings outside. No one raised a hand. Warwick looked around, called the names of 2 men, then a 3rd, and none of them looked up. Reuben was the first to speak. He said only that he wanted to ask Mr. Warwick when he had taken the papers from the old man's safe and handed them to an outsider. After that question, no one defended him. Before nightfall, Warwick Santoro's name had been struck from the common ledger. Every share he held in the operations had been taken from him, and he was driven to the airport in the very car he had always used. On Monday morning, the yellow envelope rested inside Marin's briefcase as they set out for City Hall. Gus drove the lead car, with a second vehicle following behind. When they entered the tunnel beneath the boulevard, 2 cars without license plates came up alongside them and slowly forced them toward the center lane, one pulling ahead and slowing down while the other stayed close on their left. Gus spoke one brief sentence to the man in the back seat. Rafe didn't look outside. He turned to Marin and held out his hand. "Give it to me." She handed him the envelope. He didn't keep it. He lowered the window, and when an opening appeared between the 2 lanes as the second car drew close enough, he passed the envelope to the man inside it, then motioned for them to go. The second car surged ahead. Rafe turned to her. "Get into that car," he said. She said no. "You're the one who has to stand there and read it," he said. "Not me." Then he opened the door, and Gus kept their speed just slow enough for her to cross over. She settled into the back seat of the second car, and as it accelerated toward the mouth of the tunnel, She turned to look through the rear window. Gus's car was slowing down. It changed lanes, cut across the path of both cars without plates, then switched on its turn signal and took the branch of the tunnel leading in the opposite direction, and both of the other cars followed it. In the moment before they disappeared from sight, Marin saw Rafe turn his head to look back. He didn't wave. He gave her only one nod, exactly one, and then the tunnel lights swallowed the car. The hearing room on the second floor of City Hall was packed, with folding chairs added along both sides of the aisles, and at the back of the room, 3 cameras from local television stations were broadcasting live. Sterling Voss sat in the front row on the right, wearing a gray suit, a folder of documents resting neatly on his lap. He presented first, and he presented very well. He spoke about how long the neighborhood had been abandoned, about the number of jobs the project would create, about taxes, and about how an empty piece of land in the heart of the city was a wound everyone could see but no one was willing to stitch closed. When he sat down, applause rose from several rows of seats. The chairperson asked whether anyone had registered to speak as a local business owner. Marin stood. She wore her old coat, her hair fastened with a plastic clip, and when she walked to the podium, a silence settled over the room, the silence of people trying to guess who this woman was. She stated her name and the address of her diner, then said she wasn't there to speak about the project. She was there to speak about a set of documents. She opened the yellow envelope. She read Inspector Arthur Pell's original report, word for word, slowly, from the first line to the last, including the section ordering the apartments vacated so the building could be reinforced, the section that had never been submitted. She read the date written on it. Then she read the bank statement, the amount of money, and the name of the entity that had transferred it. Chairs began shifting throughout the room. Then she placed the old tape recorder beside the microphone and pressed the button. The old man's voice came first, hoarse and slow. Then came the second man's voice, smooth and courteous, asking about the cost of college tuition that year before remarking that some reports were best left inside a drawer. The entire room listened to the recording from beginning to end. No one stood. When the tape stopped, Marin folded the paper and spoke. "For 6 winters, this city has called my husband a murderer," she said. "The only person in this room who signed the death certificates of 9 human beings is sitting in the front row. And only a few minutes ago, he called it an investment opportunity." Sterling Voss rose. He made it halfway down the aisle before 2 people in plain clothes stepped forward from the back of the room, and he stopped between the rows of chairs beneath the glare of the cameras. The chairperson struck the gavel 3 times. Rafe stood at the back of the hearing room beside the wall, having arrived only minutes earlier. He raised his hand and asked to speak. He walked to the podium, carrying no papers. He said he hadn't come there to ask anyone to clear his name of anything. He said the building had been constructed improperly from the very beginning, that he had known the truth for years before it collapsed, and that he had chosen to repair it slowly, so no one would have to move away. "I made the wrong choice," he said. "Those 32 families deserved to know what I knew, and I made that decision for them. No one forced me to do it." He fell silent for a moment, then placed a folder on the chairperson's table. He said that, as of that day, the entire parcel of land at the end of Cortlandt Street was being transferred into a community trust jointly managed by the neighborhood council and 3 civic organizations, and that the trust's charter contained a provision stating that he personally, and anyone bearing the Santoro name, would forever be prohibited from owning any part of it, profiting from it, or holding any voting rights within it. Then he spoke his final words. "As of this morning, I have also stepped down from my position in the family business," he said. "The transfer records are in this folder. I'll answer any questions the authorities may have, at any time." Then he stepped down. The entire room remained silent, and in that silence, a silver-haired woman in the 4th row rose to her feet and began applauding alone. That evening, they returned to the 51st floor, and Marin took the compass from her coat pocket and placed it on the table between them. "Where did this come from?" she asked. Rafe picked it up and turned the cracked glass toward the light. He said Elias had bought it at a second-hand shop on Maxwell Street when he was 17, using money he had earned teaching piano to the neighborhood children, and that he had given it to their mother for her birthday with a joke about how she was always getting lost in the supermarket and needed it. She had laughed all evening. She had kept it in her coat pocket from that day forward and carried it everywhere, even to the market, even when she only went down to the courtyard. He fell silent for a moment. Then he said, They found it in my mother's hand. She had been gripping it so tightly that the glass cracked. Maren said nothing. She looked at the two initials engraved on the back. E.S. And she understood why it had rested silently in her pocket for all those months, like a question no one had answered. Rafe placed it back on the table and pushed it toward her. "On our wedding night," he said, "I had nothing to leave you. That was the only thing I had that seemed worthy of you." She lifted the compass with both hands, and this time, she didn't put it back in her pocket. That spring, they began clearing the land at the end of the street. The following spring, the new building opened, 3 stories tall, with red brick walls, high windows, and metal letters across the front, spelling Rosalind House. The ground floor was the diner, still bearing its old name, still with 11 red leather stools along the counter, still with the same red neon sign, except this time, every letter was glowing. The 2 upper floors housed a free music school for neighborhood children, and in the lobby, a small plaque bore the name Elias Santoro, and a short line saying that he had once played piano on that street. The entire neighborhood came for the opening. Grandma Ora wore a new coat, sat in the second row, and saved seats for 3 people. Gus Hale arrived, holding his fedora in his hands. In the center of the lobby stood a piano covered with a white cloth, and when the cloth was pulled away, the whole room applauded. Then Maren called Micah's name. The 9-year-old boy walked forward, pulled out the bench, sat down, adjusted his glasses, and placed both hands on the keys. He played the first song he had learned during the trial class the week before, playing slowly and silently, counting under his breath, and near the end, he struck the wrong note. He stopped, turned to look at the entire room, then shrugged and said loudly, "The first one always goes wrong." The whole lobby burst into laughter and applause, and the boy had to stand and bow twice. Rafe stood at the back of the room beside the door, both hands in his pockets. He didn't say a word throughout the ceremony, but for as long as that boy sat at the piano, Rafe didn't look away once, and it was the first time in 6 winters that he had looked directly at something belonging to his younger brother without having to step outside. Maren made her way through the crowd carrying a cup of coffee. She handed it to him. It was a blue ceramic cup with a chip missing from the rim. Before setting it on the table beside him, she tapped the wood twice, exactly as her mother had done behind the counter for 20 years. "Drink it before it gets cold," she said. He took it in both hands, and he smiled. This story reminds us that no one deserves to be remembered only for the worst night of their life, and that an act of kindness given without any need for recognition can return years later to save the very person who offered it. Redemption isn't something others grant us. It is something we must rebuild every day with our own hands. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give another person isn't help, but the right to choose their own life. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that each day you can join us in listening to more meaningful stories. How did Maren and Rafe's story make you feel? What part of it reminded you of someone in your own life? Please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the depths of your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health and a life filled with joy and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.